The first thing I heard after the call dropped was the laugh, small, bright and lethal, like a stone skipping across iced water. I had spent a life building things people could not break easily. I never expected a petty whisper to crack me. But it did. Your mother is a good-for-nothing old wretched beggar who extorts us at every chance, Olivier breathed, as if the words were nothing more than an idle garnish on their evening. My hand tightened around the receiver. He chuckled. They both thought the line had ended. They never imagined I could still hear them. If you're watching this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing this story from. I want to see just how far a mother's voice can travel. My name is Sharon Whitmore. I built Whitmore Realty from a kitchen table idea into a company that shaped our town. I taught James to read deeds and sit through long board meetings. I molded him into the sort of son who would carry an empire forward. Retirement was meant to be soft. Gardens, slow mornings, the kind of quiet people write about when they forget the years of work behind it. That quiet concealed a debt in my name. Years earlier, when James was reckless and hungry, a development went sour. Funds vanished, contractors disappeared, investors protested. He was young and proud. I was older and desperate. To shield him, I signed papers and accepted the liability. $2 million in restitution. 10 years of monthly payments. I drained savings, cashed insurance, sold properties I had meant to keep. I called it a mother's bargain. I did it because I believed protecting my child protected the company. I did it because I feared scandal more than shame. I paid silently while James expanded the business, unaware that each paycheck he issued to me was another quiet step toward burying a secret. When Olivier first entered their lives, she wore confidence like fine silk. She organized charity galas, spoke at investor luncheons, and moved through social circles with sharp grace. To James she was a partner. To some of our older clients, she was the new face of ambition. To me, beneath the poise, there was always a thinness, an impatience for control. Over the years, small complaints grew into a pattern. Olivier bristled at my requests. James frowned and called them reasonable. "We'll handle it," he would say. "We know what's best." But the requests were not extravagant. They were for medicine, for the roof patched after a storm, for groceries when the monthly stipend fell short. Each refusal stung more than the last. That night on the phone, the words were a cube of cold truth. They reduced me to a caricature. An old woman begging at the table she had set. The laughter that followed felt like heat. Humiliation spreading and setting. For days I moved through the house like someone wearing a new bruise. Had I miscalculated everything? Had my sacrifices only fed ingratitude? Anger flared briefly. It is a tempting engine. Confront, demand, let the thunder do its work. But fire consumes the builder as well as the built. I had learned to be strategic. So I turned away from the voice that wanted instant reckoning, and toward a long, deliberate plan. I opened the cedar chest in the spare room. The one everyone assumed held quilts and old letters. I had over the years stored receipts and contracts there, proofs and remnants of the mess I had once managed. I pulled each paper out like a careful archaeologist. There were bank transfers with tiny annotations, contracts signed in James's name, letters from contractors who had vanished and then reappeared in other towns. There were signed sworn statements I had given to regulators, the documents that left. Something shifted as I read. What had been a burden became leverage. The same actions I once took to spare my son could now force him to answer. I did not relish the thought, but I understood the currency of truth. I met a lawyer in Minneapolis who understood discretion. She had no dramatic gestures, no theatrical promises, only a methodical assessment. "The law will not reward sentiment," she said, "but it will reward paper." So I prepared paper. I cataloged payments, notarized memories, and lined up witnesses from a past I had been too weary to revisit. Each page tightened the net around the corner they had thought safe. I am not the woman who will shout her victory from the courthouse steps. I'm quieter than that. My plan was never to annihilate, merely to correct. I wanted what was legally mine, my share as co-founder and co-signatory, and the dignity of not being dismissed as a nuisance in my own family. The hinge of my story is not the debt. It is the whisper that converted a lifetime of quiet sacrifice into action. From that night, The world narrowed to documents and decisions. I chose exposure over silence, not to humiliate, but to reclaim what had been surrendered under a different name. Protection. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They would learn otherwise. I would not flinch when the truth came for them. This was only the beginning. The scandal began with a handshake and a shimmer of possibility. In the spring of a boom, James leaned into a land development that promised quick yields and glowing projections. There was a contractor who spoke with the kind of certainty investors like to hear, and a spreadsheet that looked irresistible to a young executive hungry to prove himself. Payments were rerouted, invoices inflated, and then the contractor vanished. Letters from investors arrived, polite at first and then edged with legal language. Federal regulators traced $2 million in liabilities to our name. I remember the notice. A plain envelope whose heading felt like winter. They demanded restitution and accountability. James wanted to meet the storm head-on. He said the firm could weather it. That boldness would be vindication. I saw, underneath his bravado, panic. For a moment I considered letting him face the consequences. But the prospect of his name dragged through hearings, his future narrowed by a youthful mistake, made my chest tighten. I could not bear it. So I stepped in. I signed repayment agreements and met with regulators. I accepted penalties in my name, pledged assets I had intended to keep, and promised staggered payments for the years ahead. $2 million became a calendar of due dates and survival calculations. I sold a lake cabin, cashed a policy, and funneled funds until the mountain looked like a long stair. Life contracted around that schedule. I learned restitution's language and watched bank balances like a slow leak. I stopped traveling and grew frugal with warmth. Dinner guests became rarer, and visits with friends were scheduled less often. Publicly, Whitmore Realty thrived. James preserved our image with skill, but privately I lived in accounts and envelopes, calculating which payment could wait for another month. Secrecy reshaped relationships. A mother who had always solved problems became small when she asked for help. Where I expected gratitude, there were questions about entitlement. Olivier translated my need into weakness. Her language was businesslike rather than maternal. They are enabling, she would tell James. They will ruin us, she had warned at a brunch once. I kept records. Years of bookkeeping habits persisted. Canceled checks, annotated bank transfers, photocopies of contracts with notes in the margins. I logged everything not out of spite, but because facts are stubborn things. I told myself the papers were pragmatic, a private order in a life filled with public obligations. The cedar chest held more than receipts. It held the proof that I had carried the burden alone. There were other quiet clues tucked in the files. An email chain that suggested gamesmanship, a misfiled invoice, a payment that did not add up. At the time I did not pursue those threads. My energy went to paying restitution and ensuring the company functioned. The world saw a successful firm and a capable son. Inside my home the rhythm was different, measured by due dates and hushed economies. Secrecy required theater. I kept my hair neat for visitors, attended ribbon cuttings, and smiled through investor luncheons. Maintaining that face was invisible labor. It kept the firm's polish but eroded my private truth. People praised our legacy while I counted payments in the lonely hours. If there was a moral calculus, I told myself I had done right. Mothers are expected to protect, and I had protected. But protection has a limit, and its end is marked by erosion. Years into the payments I felt that erosion. Friendships frayed, a sense of belonging thinned, and part of my identity receded into receipts and envelopes. Secrets do not vanish, they calcify. They turn a house into a set of rooms you traverse with caution. For years I paid and pretended until a whisper on a dropped call revealed how brittle the arrangement truly was. What had been a private bargain could, if forced into the light, be judged for what it was. A gamble that had cost me more than money. I kept paying, kept smiling, kept the truth folded into cedar chest. I thought that was enough, until a whisper on a phone taught me otherwise. And I was wrong. Olivier entered our lives like a carefully arranged photograph. Everything in place, every angle measured. She was younger than James, with a readiness that looked like competence. When she first came to the office, she carried a leather portfolio and a firm handshake that made clients feel seen. James introduced her at a charity gala, and for a while I watched them with an easy pride. He was proud, she was polished, and the firm gained a new public face. At first, Olivier appeared grateful and organized polished benefit events. She sent notes after minor illnesses and once brought a ribbon pie. Small acts that made me believe she embraced family. But kindness had margins. Olivier loved systems and hated unpredictability. She read spreadsheets for pleasure and delighted in streamlining processes. Conversations with her inevitably returned to efficiency, brand coherence, and the elimination of redundancies. She spoke in crisp sentences and expected responses of equal clarity. The first cut came when I asked for help after a storm. "Have you considered selling that property?" she asked almost casually, as if my question could be solved by a simple balance sheet maneuver. When I mentioned medical bills, she suggested assistance programs, rather than offering a hand. Her responses implied I had not been prudent. They suggested solutions that bypassed compassion. James loved her mind. He admired the way she could secure meetings and simplify negotiations. He developed a taste for her decisiveness and began mirroring her language. The two of them started making decisions in a cadence that left little room for me. Meetings scheduled at odd hours, internal emails copied to narrow circles, strategies discussed over dinners where I was an afterthought. She cultivated allies among younger employees who found her pace invigorating. She praised those who adapted quickly and suggested promotions for employees who echoed her values. The culture tilted toward speed and audacity. The company personality shifted from stewardship, which I prized, to an appetite for growth that sometimes bordered on recklessness. She masked cruelty as pragmatism. A shareholder's brunch suggestion to recalculate founders' stipends landed like a public slight. The room applauded efficiency. The sting of being reduced to a line on a budget was immediate. That moment made me feel like a relic at my own table. At home she coached James, replacing lessons of patience with mantras. Image matters. Perception is capital. Where I had taught trust and care, she taught velocity and polish. Her influence eroded patience. Small lapses, missed calls, a forgotten birthday, turned into evidence of inconvenience. My restitution requests became signs of poor planning, not sacrifice. She cultivated allies among staff and built an internal culture aligned with her views, and James began to prioritize brand and efficiency over the eccentricities I prized. Conversations changed. Questions about my health or roof took on the tone of budget meetings. My needs felt accidental, not human. Her entrance did not cause the scandal, but it changed how the family handled it. She treated the scandal as a risk to be sanitized rather than a wound to be tended. Perception and growth trumped gratitude and history. In that era, my sacrifices could be rewritten as liabilities and my requests reclassified as burdens. By the time the whisper on the phone landed, the ground beneath me had been turned for some time. The seeds of contempt had been sown. The laughter that night did not fall into emptiness. It landed on soil Olivier had cultivated. The harvest would be bitter. Retirement, I learned, is a delicate ledger. I had imagined mornings lit slowly, coffee, newspapers, afternoons in a garden that had once been merely ornamental. Instead, my days became an exercise in economizing, a quiet accounting of what could be postponed and what could not. People assumed that a founder of a thriving firm had a cushion. They did not see the monthly notices that arrived with the cold language of restitution. I kept a modest rhythm. Early walks at the lake and afternoons in the garden. But my bank accounts told a different story. Monthly restitution notices rearranged my choices. The roofer's estimate, a dental appointment, rising prescriptions, all moved around due dates. I sold a lake cabin, cashed a policy, and tightened spending until even small comforts felt indulgent. Pride became my companion. Practical failures became moral dilemmas. When the boiler failed or the roof leaked, I patched what I could rather than call James and risk sounding needy. His stipend covered basics, but restitution chewed away at what remained. Grocery lists shrank, hobbies were postponed, visits with friends became rare. Even as I tightened, I kept receipts and canceled checks, muscle memory from decades of running a company. There was loneliness. Retirement removed the daily hum of problem solving. That absence became a place where echoes gathered. On Sundays I passed the office and felt like a founder turned spectator. I called James less to spare him annoyance, and to avoid the tinge of impatience in his voice. When I asked for help, once for a furnace filter, once for a dental bill, the responses were clipped. Budget constraints, James said. His kindness arrived as corporate pragmatism, and that stung. Olivier's reaction was colder. Apply for assistance, trim assets, adjust spending. When she said, we can't keep enabling old patterns, I felt my history reduced to a hindrance. At dinner parties she toasted smart stewardship, an oblique judgment. I walked a tightrope, maintain dignity and avoid imposition. I resented asking for ordinary help. That resentment settled into resolve. I would not beg or humiliate myself. I would find a way to be whole without surrendering dignity. Medical checkups became fraught. I delayed a colonoscopy because urgency was weighed against payments. It felt strange for someone who once brokered million-dollar deals to balance life against a ledger. Maintaining appearances required separate labor. I kept my hair neat, attended luncheons where clients wanted to see the founder, and smiled while inventorying receipts in the spare room. The cedar box became a private archive of those decisions. I told stories of early days when clients were friends, and kept my ledger hidden under a quiet domestic life. Some nights I considered telling James everything and laying the papers on the table. I imagined guilt and relief. But I feared losing his image of me as prudent and in control. I feared anger more than solace. So I persisted. I paced my spending, and carried the secret like an heirloom grown heavy. In the hollow of night I pictured James as a boy with soil-stained hands, memories that helped me keep going. Retirement exposed seams. I expected my son to care for me. Instead I navigated dignity and dependence until the call. An ordinary request met with an ordinary cruelty. A whisper that fractured the fragile peace of my quiet life. That whisper set the rest of the story in motion. The call began like any other. A request for help wrapped in ordinary language. I had phoned James about a small medical expense and a roof repair. The tone was domestic, the kind of exchange families navigate without drama. The night was ordinary, lamplight over the kitchen table, the hum of an old refrigerator, until a voice became a blade. Olivier spoke plainly. Your mother is a good-for-nothing old wretched beggar who extorts us at every chance. James laughed. They thought the line was dead. They thought I was out of earshot. I held the receiver longer than I should have. I could have hung up and folded the insult into the stack of grievances one collects with age. Instead, the words landed with a weight that rearranged how I saw the ledgers of my life. They made visible the small humiliations I had absorbed and transformed them into a ledger of wrongs. That night I went to the cedar box and spread everything on the kitchen table. Cancelled checks, contracts, stamped envelopes, regulator correspondence. I had kept these things as habit, an accountant's reflex, but suddenly they seemed like ammunition. The same documents I had used to shelter James now charted a different path. One of accountability. Sleep did not come. I made a plan quietly and with care. I wrote a list of documents that proved chronology, identified possible witnesses. A contractor who had once called to apologize. An accountant who had handled odd transfers, and drafted a timeline that tracked the diverted funds. My anger was not a hot glare, it was a cold, focused purpose. I imagined not a confrontation, but a sequence of legal moves that would demand answers. The next morning I called a lawyer, discreet, steady, practiced in family and corporate claims. We met in a small office lined with law books. She read the papers, asked precise questions, and said, "You have standing. There may be a path to claim your co-founder rights and challenge irregular transfers." The strategy was methodical. Preserve evidence, request internal records, file for declaratory relief to establish ownership rights. Where a whisper once cut me, a subpoena could force answers. The lawyer's letter to the company was a formal pebble dropped into a previously quiet pond. The firm scrambled. James was stunned. Olivier's expression hardened. Discovery unfolded in windowed rooms where the air smelled of coffee. Motions, depositions, inquiries. Each procedural step revealed more about how money moved and who knew what. A contractor remembered a transfer to an oddly named account. An accountant found annotations that raised questions. Facts accumulate in a way whispers do not. The public responded quickly. Gossip columns like the stories bite. Family dynasty, hidden debt, a matriarch suing her son. Investors paused. Some clients asked for reassurances. The company's shine dimmed under scrutiny. But in the swirl of public opinion, my aim was narrower. To reclaim dignity and force accountability where secrecy had allowed mockery. People ask whether this was revenge. Part of it was. I felt violated. But it was also necessity. Secrecy had been cast as protection. The whisper proved it had become a liability to my personhood. I would not let mockery define what I had given. I recalled James as a boy, sticky with soil, listening as I explained deeds and parcels. Memory hardened me. I could not let a whispered mockery erase decades of sacrifice. The courtroom would not be theater. It would be reckoning and, I hoped, restoration. The house that had once felt like a trophy case of victories began to feel like a gallery of small betrayals. I walked its rooms tracing memories. A framed photograph of the first property sale. A plaque from a charity luncheon. A name tag of a young intern who later became a manager. Each object had weight and history, but after the whisper everything around me seemed to accumulate significance in a new register. How many favors, how many unpaid debts, how many nights I had swallowed my pride. I had believed for years that sacrifice was a private currency, and that the market of gratitude would balance itself in time. That belief died the night Olivier's words drifted across a phone line. The laughter felt like an audit of my life. I replayed the moment until the kitchen felt smaller and the cedar box heavier. The papers were no longer just proof of patience. They were the ledger of my invisibility. Grief arrived first, a quiet, cold sorrow. I mourned not just the insult but every instance where I had made allowances for my son's errors. Every dinner where I had swallowed a sharp retort to preserve family decorum. Tears came in odd places. When I found an old ledger with James's first scrawl. When I discovered a child's drawing tucked in a book. When the house keys jangled and no one asked if I needed help. The grief was ordinary and deep, the kind that demands a new map for living. Anger followed. It was precise and pragmatic. I did not want to burn bridges for the satisfaction of a bonfire. I wanted to recalibrate the accounts. Anger sharpened into focus. I began to see a plan where before there had only been reaction. I stopped rehearsing conversations and started listing outcomes. What would regain my dignity? What would ensure that my sacrifices were recognized? And what would prevent further mockery? There was fear. Taking action meant exposing family to public scrutiny. I was aware of how the press loved a family fall, how gossip could turn a boy who loved model trains into a villain stripped of nuance. I feared for James, but I feared more the slow corrosion of being reduced to a punchline. The calculus was miserable. Protect the son at the cost of my dignity, or protect my dignity at the cost of his image. The latter felt like a debt unpaid. I began to rehearse the mechanics of a lawsuit in my head. The legal process required foundations. Evidence, witnesses, timing. I returned to the cedar box with new eyes. Each document was no longer a relic, but a structural component. Cancelled checks showed months of careful transfers. Annotations revealed improvised solutions after a contractor's disappearance. Copies of regulatory notices bore the date stamps that led to a timeline. The chest was a library of leverage. I began calling people quietly. A contractor who had once apologized for delays, an accountant who had noticed odd transfers, a regulatory clerk who remembered my name. Each conversation began as curiosity, then moved to specifics. Memories that were hazy sharpened when I mentioned dates and invoices. I photocopied pages and sent careful notes. Confirmations appeared. A misplaced invoice here, an unexplained transfer there. Each detail was a stitch. At home I reorganized the cedar box into labeled files and timelines. I wrote a chronology on legal pads. The chronology became a map of decisions and consequences. I rehearsed questions for depositions, imagined how to present sequence without bitterness, and practiced the voice I would use in court, steady, factual, unafraid. The lawyer explained discovery like a machine that exposed internal mechanics. That explanation reduced dread to work. Night after night I prepared, and the work made me feel less like a victim and more like an architect of my fate. I summoned courage like currency. Courage is not absence of fear but the choice to proceed despite it. I called the lawyer I had met in Minneapolis and scheduled another meeting. Each step felt weighted. Each decision had consequence. Yet in each conversation, where fear had once occupied the room, resolve had begun to sit. By evening, the house felt different. It was not lighter. Truth rarely is, but it was aligned with intent. I had stepped across a threshold where private endurance gave way to public action. The whisper had shattered something, but from the shards I would construct a new order. The question was no longer whether I would act, it was which steps would be taken first. Decisively. I had never viewed law as theater. It had always been a toolkit. When I walked into the Minneapolis office, the lawyer had a steady, businesslike air and a desk that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. She introduced herself as Elaine, and her handshake was firm without flourish. There were no dramatic turns, no promises to tear the firm apart. Only a clear-eyed explanation of what was necessary. Elaine wanted organized evidence. She asked for timelines, bank statements, correspondence, and any record that showed the lineage of payments. I laid the cedar chest on her table, like an offering. The documents that had been a private archive suddenly reported themselves. Signatures, dates, memos, and annotations that tracked years of improvised fixes. We worked through the afternoon, cataloging every item and forming a narrative that could be presented in court. She sketched out the strategy with surgical logic. First, a declaratory judgment to establish my legal rights as co-founder and signatory. Second, discovery. Subpoenas that would force the company to produce internal records. Third, a motion to present evidence of transfers that suggested irregularities. She cautioned against scorched earth tactics. The goal was not humiliation but legal recognition and corrective action. We discussed timing and optics. Elaine emphasized the need for discretion at the outset. A public filing without groundwork could invite preemptive damage control. So we prepared cover letters, retained expert witnesses, a forensic accountant and a compliance analyst, and crafted a measured press statement in case the media circled. We could not predict every reaction, but we would be ready. I asked about costs. She was frank. Litigation is expensive, it consumes money and time. But the ledger told its own story. I had poured lifetimes into repayment and could not let an insult erase a career. If necessary, we would fund the case through a retainer and a contingency plan. Elaine promised to limit exposure where possible and to pursue negotiation when it made sense. Next, she suggested discovery algorithms. Requests tailored to reveal financial flows, emails that referenced the disputed projects, and internal memos that could illustrate who had knowledge of the initial problem. The lawyer explained how metadata could reveal alterations, how bank routing numbers could point to intermediary accounts. I listened, feeling a strange mix of academic curiosity and sharp resolve. There was something intoxicating about turning paper into proof. We scheduled depositions for a few individuals who might illuminate the timeline. A contractor who had rerouted invoices, an office manager who handled payroll, and an outside accountant who had once flagged a suspicious transfer. Elaine warned me that memories are fickle and that recollections could be contradictory, hence the need for corroborating paper. We drafted questions that would be factual, not speculative, so the court could evaluate the sequence without drama. At home, I continued to organize. I made color-coded folders, chronology, payments, correspondence, and witness notes. Each envelope was a chapter in the narrative I intended to present. I wrote a cover memo that explained my decisions in plain language. Why I had accepted liability once, why I had paid restitution, and why I now sought recognition. The memo was a moral map. It argued that my secrecy had been sacrificial, not deceitful, and that recognition would correct an imbalance. We also prepared for counterarguments. James's likely claims, gratitude for being sheltered, the emotional cost of exposure, were anticipated. Elaine advised framing the suit not as a punitive measure, but as an assertion of legal rights. That framing would make it harder for James to portray me as vengeful. The strategy felt like chess. Every move anticipated a possible reply. Confidentiality was paramount. We set up secure channels to transmit documents. I met with the forensic accountant in a small cafe, where we spoke in low voices over coffee. He showed me how to read bank codes and how to trace transfers through shell entities. I felt the cool exhilaration of assembling facts like tiles in a mosaic. As plans solidified, I noticed an odd sensation. Freedom. Freedom to name what had been unspoken. Freedom to insist on a reality where contributions were recognized. It was not vindictiveness. It was recognition. I kept thinking of James's younger face, the boy who learned deeds at my knee, and my actions felt less like betrayal than correction. I believed stewardship required truth. When the complaint was ready, we filed quietly. The filing's first pages were procedural and dry, but the attachments were dense. Bank statements, correspondence, and the timeline I had pinned to my kitchen wall. The company received the notice and, as predictable, responded with shock. James called, voice-edged. He accused me of betrayal. I told him only that I had asked for help and had been called names. His silence that followed was not relief but calculation. Elaine advised patience. Litigation is marathon and not sprint. It unfolds in rhythms that favor the prepared. We would not rush into media warfare, but would lift the curtain slowly as facts demanded. The plan was in motion: discovery, depositions, and a trial if necessary. I signed the final documents with hands that did not tremble. The law was no longer just a toolkit. It was a way to reassert the value of a life. Not even by his wife. The day the complaint arrived, I felt a prick of disappointment and a strange relief, as if a pressure valve had been loosened. The company's general counsel received our notice with a terse email. An assistant called me to say there would be questions. For a week the office hummed with a quiet tension like a room before an announcement. James called that evening. His voice was controlled. He sounded older, that made my heart ache. "Ma," he said, "are you sure this is necessary?" He meant it kindly, but his next sentence folded the question into disbelief. "I can fix this. We can talk, mediate." He believed mediation could erase what had been hidden. I told him that conversation had occurred long ago. What remained was formal recognition. He accused me of acting out of spite. I did not argue. Instead, I told him that words had meaning and actions had consequences. He swore that he would fight, that no reasonable counsel would allow a controlling share to be wrested by the woman they perceived as sentimental. His certainty was a kind of armor. I heard it and, with a calm I did not entirely feel, reminded him that facts were heavier than armor. James's initial counsel sent a response that counseled caution and framed the filing as irrational. They painted me as emotional and ill-advised. It was a standard play: make the plaintiff appear unstable. I expected the tactic. What surprised me was how quickly Olivier entered the fray. Her statements, measured, confident, and blade-sharp, appeared in boardroom emails and in a carefully worded op-ed defending James's stewardship. She argued that the firm needed stability and that public squabbles would damage reputation. The firm posted a short statement emphasizing unity and promising to cooperate with legal processes. Clients fielded calls and some required reassurances. Investors sent guarded notes. I received a few sympathetic messages from long-ago colleagues, but most contacts were polite distance. The world had a way of reorganizing itself around scandal. People chose sides. James's lawyers asked for an informal meeting. Elaine recommended we accept one if it did not require disclosing strategy. So we met in a neutral room. James arrived with Olivier. He had the look of someone who expected an apology and a quick end. But when we began to talk, the conversation tightened around framing. He emphasized reputation and risk. I emphasized document-backed facts and the legal rights that accompanied them. The meeting did not resolve matters. It allowed each side to posture. James to insist the company needed calm, me to insist on legal recognition. But it also revealed fissures. In private, some board members whispered about legacy and liability. Several suggested negotiation. Others claimed litigation could be destructive. I listened to factional murmurs and realized the firm's cohesion had been thinner than I had believed. As discovery dates approached, the company mobilized. IT teams began scanning archives. Emails were archived in systems that tracked metadata. I had anticipated some of this. Elaine's team had counseled us how to request specific sets of records, and what to do if obstruction occurred. Litigation is often a contest of endurance. I understood that the firm could bury or delay evidence. Our job was to be persistent and precise. The first formal hearing was procedural. A judge asked procedural questions and ordered initial discovery. Elaine appeared poised and professional. Opposing counsel presented objections and claimed undue burden. The judge set timelines and insisted on cooperation. For the first time since the whisper, I felt the machinery of accountability move in my favor. Outside the courtroom, whispers piped through local circles. An opposition blog picked up the courthouse docket and suggested family drama. A financial newsletter ran a dry piece about risk to regional portfolios. Socially, Olivier began to appear more composed and, I suspected, more aggressive. She made strategic appearances at events to reassure clients and to maintain image. Her public performance was efficient, but it also revealed her willingness to push back without regard for sentiment. I thought often about the boy who had learned to measure plots in the backyard and how his grown version now navigated lawyers and PR. I also thought about my own role. Aged, injured in dignity, but methodical in pursuit. Litigation introduced discomforts, long waits, depositions that replayed private moments, emails scanned for tone. But it also introduced clarity. Facts do not always comfort, but they are less cruel than rumors. As the case progressed, both sides sharpened arguments. Some company leaders urged settlement. Others warned that ceding ground would create precedent. The firm's future, which James had long treated as his to shape, had become a contested estate. In quiet moments, when paper sat heavy in my lap like unspent currency, I realized this was no longer about money alone. It was a reckoning about memory, respect, and the kind of legacy a family wanted to leave. The complaint had been filed, and the gears were turning. The law is awkward and slow, but it moves with the patient gravity of tides. For now I waited. Waiting was not passive. It was preparation in a new form. I read, I annotated, and I steeled myself for depositions. The whisper's echo no longer merely hurt. It propelled me toward a resolution I had long deferred. Olivier had always struck me as someone who could make a room reflect her will. Where I prized history and stewardship, she prized image and momentum. During the early days of the lawsuit, her skills transformed from elegant efficiency to strategic offense. She moved swiftly, aligning allies and shaping narratives. She asked pointed questions about succession plans and founder stipends. She urged the board to prepare contingency strategies. Her language was surgical. Mitigate risk, maintain liquidity, reassure markets. Her calm felt like control, and it unsettled people. Many preferred the certainty she offered to the messy tenderness I embodied. She cultivated staging. At a fundraiser, she orchestrated a toast that subtly reframed the company's challenges as tests of leadership. A clear signal to the public that Whitmore Realty needed steady hands. She began speaking at investor panels, emphasizing continuity and the dangers of internal fights. Each public appearance carried the twin signals of competence and inevitability. Behind closed doors, her tactics hardened. She encouraged James to hire a high-powered litigation team known for scorched earth tactics. She argued that showing weakness would invite profiteers and opportunists. She framed legal aggression as fiduciary responsibility. I could see how persuasive this sounded. A board that hoped to protect assets and reputation could mistake aggression for wisdom. At-home conversations with James went from personal to strategic. They schemed about messaging, about legal narratives, about how to make any settlement appear as a stabilization rather than a concession. James began scheduling meetings at odd hours, and spending more time with staff who echoed Olivier's urgency. He grew distant in a way that felt orchestrated. She sought to make the slightest concession seem like a failure. She cultivated allies among junior executives who admired her, and felt rewarded when she advanced them. Those promoted began to repeat her language, leverage, risk models, brand value, and the company brain adapted. Her influence extended beyond corporate maneuvering. At social events, she cultivated a sympathetic narrative. A young family under siege, a mother put in a difficult position, a son straining to save what his parents had built. In salons and charity circles, she quietly suggested that a lawsuit would harm not only earnings but community initiatives. Her tone implied there was a human cost to spectacle. But manipulation is a brittle thing. It requires plausible deniability. Olivier preserved that deniability with checks and scripts. When I asked once if she had ever wondered why I had taken liability, She smiled and offered platitudes about stewardship. When I insisted on clarity, she changed the subject to the company's projected growth. Her avoidance was tactical. She would never tie herself directly to past mistakes. And yet, under scrutiny, patterns began to reveal themselves. During discovery, the forensic accountant found emails that suggested Olivier had been more involved earlier than she had publicly admitted. A memo surfaced where she advised streamlining founder stipends, and another where she questioned recurring payments that had once been attributed to administrative costs. It didn't prove bad faith, but it suggested she had been attentive to the mechanics of revenue flows. When such findings leaked to the board, reactions varied. Some were cautious. Her actions had been within the bounds of corporate governance. Others bristled. How could a daughter-in-law influence financial policy without explicit authority? The question itself was destabilizing. Suddenly Olivier's influence was a governance issue, not merely a family dynamic. She spoke to the press with surgical calm, and to the board with strategic urgency. In private, she told James the old guard had to be moved aside for the company to survive. In public, she emphasized unity. The contradiction was her shield. I was often tempted to confront Olivier directly, to demand the truth about what she had seen and when. But truth extracted in anger can be messy. Elaine advised restraint. Let discovery peel layers back methodically, rather than give Olivier a stage for performative contrition. I followed that counsel. As depositions began, Olivier's polished demeanor proved an asset. She answered questions with practiced neutrality, deflecting personal ones with corporate language. Yet under cross-examination there were micro-moments. A hesitation, a misremembered date, a slight recalibration. Each was small alone, but in pattern they could become meaningfully suggestive. I watched Olivier's public halo slowly develop cracks. People are persuasive until evidence organizes otherwise. The strategy of control had looked flawless until the law demanded documentation. She had built her defenses out of narrative. I had built mine out of paper. The contest between story and document was underway, and it favored the sober precision of records. In the quiet hours I thought of the cost of influence. Olivier had succeeded at making James see the company as an extension of his will, and it had changed him. She had played conviction against sentiment, and in doing so, had sharpened the divisions that would ultimately be exposed. I felt no glee at this realization. Only the painful clarity that power, wielded without awareness of history, can become brittle. When the board convened to discuss interim leadership options, the room was tense. Supporters of Olivier argued for continuity. Others called for a temporary committee to preserve neutrality during the process. The debate laid bare the deeper dilemma. Could a company founded on stewardship survive a season of legal scrutiny without sacrificing the very culture that defined it? Olivier had pushed the question to the fore, and now it would have answers. The first day of trial arrived with a brittle sunrise. I woke early, looked at the papers I would carry, and felt an odd hush, a legal calm that tempered tremor. The courthouse loomed, stone, formal, and indifferent, and inside it the mechanics of truth would be worked. I wore a simple navy suit. Elaine said not to overdress. I entered the courtroom with a folder of documents that had been annotated and indexed until each page felt like a measured step. The courtroom was a stage that disliked melodrama. The judge moved with an economy of presence, and the bailiff's gavel punctuated preliminary motions. The opening hours were procedural, objections, motions to strike, and counsel shuffling papers. Yet beneath the formality I felt the geography of the case shift with each exchanged exhibit. This was a place where numbers could speak louder than slogans. Elaine began the factual narrative in a voice that was both composed and direct. She described a history of transfers, of payments made under my name, and of advisory notes that suggested others had written off certain liabilities as administrative. She called a forensic accountant to the stand. He walked the jury through a spreadsheet marked with colors and arrows, showing payment dates, intermediary accounts, and discrepancies that mapped back to the period when James had managed the troubled development. The exhibit that made the courtroom hold its breath was a stamped letter from a regulator acknowledging that restitution had been paid under my name, coupled with an internal email in which an executive, copied to an internal distribution, had referenced a shift in responsibility. The juxtaposition was stark. Public registration of liability aligned with private notes that suggested the firm understood more than it let on. James's counsel tried to blunt the impact with procedural objections and alternate interpretations. They argued that administrative rerouting was common in complex transactions, that annotations did not prove malfeasance, and that my taking liability was an act of filial kindness. The defense's narrative was plausible to some, who would not protect family, but facts crowd narrative when properly linked. The forensic accountant's charts were precise and hard to dismiss. Then came a moment that would, in my view, change everything. A former contractor took the stand. He described how invoices had been redirected to an intermediary account at a bank out of state, how payments had been split, and how he had been pressured to sign affidavits that simplified the flow. Under oath he admitted to being afraid at the time, and to having misreported dates under duress. His testimony filled gaps that had been empty on paper. Olivier sat with arms folded. James looked at her as if seeking a compass from a familiar face. The jury watched quietly, faces composed. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker where each revelation increased heat. I detected a shift in James's posture. The arrogance I had once seen was replaced by a practiced composure, and then a flicker of disintegration. In cross-examination, a few details came into sharper relief. Email trails that suggested knowledge sharing. An accounting memo that compared disputed expenses to normal administrative costs. And a draft board note that hinted at a decision to absorb liability publicly while moving funds privately. It began to look less like a mother's noble sacrifice and more like a corporate convenience, or depending on your view, a cover. News vans were parked discreetly outside. Reporters scribbled notes in black notebooks. Social media picked up fragments. A contractor's admission here, a scanned letter there. The previously private story became interpretable in multiple frames. For some readers it was a tale of a matriarch who had once saved her son. For others it was proof of corporate sleight of hand concealed behind familial love. During a mid-trial break, a well-known business columnist appeared at the courthouse steps and remarked on the spectacle. The human drama wrapped in corporate detail. Headlines ran the next morning that juxtaposed my name with James's and Olivier's. The public appetite for a fall from grace is voracious. That appetite would not be satisfied by nuance. As witnesses continued, details assembled into a portrait that was less tidy than I had hoped. Facts, unlike stories, do not always align to create a clean morality play. There were contradictions, memory gaps, and plausible deniability. Yet the accumulation of evidence produced a pattern. Payments routed, internal notes, and testimonies that complemented the documentary record. I did not relish the violence of exposure. It felt like airing wounds without consent. But each revelation was also a correction. A recentering of how obligations had been assigned, and what had been hidden. The courtroom did not offer vindication in a single blow. It offered a process that could, in time, translate paper into legal recognition. At the end of the day, as the judge called recess, I stepped outside and felt the autumn air slice through the courthouse shadow. James passed me in the corridor, his face a mask. Our eyes met for a moment. Years of unspoken history compressed into a breath, and then he walked on. I felt neither triumph nor satisfaction. Instead I felt a weary clarity. Truth was being revealed, and revelation carries costs for everyone involved. That night the transcript circulated. Pundits argued about motives, but the court's timeline mattered more. I reviewed exhibits alone, marking pages that began to tell the story I kept hidden. They put reporters on the courthouse steps like a ritual, and the town learned to listen to the way sorrow sounded in print. The first week after the trial snippet ran, my name trended across regional feeds, threaded into salon gossip and financial columns alike. Headlines simplified the geometry of our family into a single axis: betrayal. Reporters wanted spectacle, pundits wanted a morality play, and my life became a set of soundbites that left nothing of the slow work that had built our firm. I watched from the kitchen window as vans circled like careful birds. Calls came in from old acquaintances, some tender, others perfunctory. People whom I had considered friends spoke in cautious phrases, as though proximity might stain them. Social media amplified fragments into verdicts. A charity board I had once chaired paused outreach events and quietly shifted my name off certain lists. The professional world reacted along a gradient of caution. The social world reacted with greater abandon. The press found patterns where I had held nuance. They juxtaposed restitution letters with scenes of James at ribbon cuttings. They culled comments from interviews to suggest hypocrisy. Olivier's curated appearances became fodder for analysis. Every smile parsed for calculation. Every public reassessment measured for sincerity. The narrative fed itself. For readers, complex motives condensed into simple archetypes. Grieving mother, ambitious wife, prodigal son. The simplification flattened the years and sacrifices that had actually defined us. I had expected some interest. Litigation in small markets always attracts attention. But the speed of amplification startled me. A national site picked up a thread, and soon our story reached audiences who had never heard the name Whitmore Realty. They did not know the houses we built or the plaques we had funded. They knew the scandal. This is the strange economy of modern outrage. One paragraph can outweigh a life's work. As coverage intensified, PR teams and lawyers on both sides learned to speak in measured tones. Press releases smoothed edges the way a cloth covers a table. James's team released statements that emphasized continuity and leadership. My counsel issued a brief note asking that facts, not conjecture, carry weight. But notes and briefs do not sing as loudly as scandal. People prefer a clear story over a complex truth. The media's appetite shaped the courtroom's echo. Word choices mattered. Dynasty, betrayal, expose. Each label reframed what had been complex choices into a film clip of motives. Editors selected the most colorful phrases and the most evocative photographs, and the result became a thing with its own behavior. Comments streamed in, condemnations, support, and speculation about motives. Some messages were cruelly intimate. Others surprised me with grace. Memories from clients who remembered how Whitmore Realty had stepped in to protect tenants in hard times. My privacy eroded, but so did James's. Where he had once navigated CEO interviews with charisma, now he appeared defensive in quick clips, his jaw tight, hands restless. Public perception, once a background hum, became a force that altered transaction flows. Clients began to call with cautious questions about continuity. Some requested reassurances that contracts would be honored. Others simply paused. In corporate life, pauses are dangerous. They open windows for competitors and sow doubt among investors. A rumor mill began. Late-night threads discussed motives that were lurid and speculative. A podcast host recounted the case as if it were a crime drama, blurring legal facts with conjecture. I felt the peculiar indignity of being made into a caricature on platforms where nuance had been traded for ratings. The law proceeds at the pace of documents and testimony. The internet moves at the pace of outrage. Even as the press fed on the drama, there were moments of tenderness from unexpected corners. A former tenant sent a note thanking me for pausing evictions during a harsh winter decade ago. A junior lawyer who had benefited from a mentorship wrote that I had once encouraged her to pursue real estate. Those notes arrived like messages in bottles. Small, precise acknowledgments that countered the broad strokes of headlines. I discovered, with some surprise, that media was a two-edged instrument. It could savage reputations, but it could also broadcast truth when truth was well documented. I worked with Elaine to prepare a dossier of consistent facts for release at strategic moments. Not for spectacle, but to give journalists a foundation of verifiable information. We supplied evidence that clarified timelines and corrected misreadings. The effect was modest. Journalists still favored drama. But the dossier allowed some facts to anchor the conversation. As the media storm circled, our home life fissured. James grew quieter in public. Olivier grew sharper in rebuttals. Friends chose sides or leaned away. Some community events we had supported quietly distanced themselves. Still, the stream of small, genuine messages continued to arrive, and in those I found a reason to keep going. The press could take headlines, but it could not unmake the decades of work. It could not diminish the truth held in stamped envelopes and signed papers. In quiet moments I reviewed the stamped envelopes in my cedar chest, and remembered why I had endured. Each marked payment, each notarized letter, testified to a life of measured choices. The press could narrate loudly, but the paper told the unadorned truth. A ledger of sacrifice I would not erase. The first domino fell as quietly as a side apology. A long-standing client called to delay their purchase. It was small by itself, a project delayed, but in corporate life small things compound until the whole edifice tips. Within days other clients followed. Contracts were paused pending assurances. Investors who prefer numbers to nuance requested audits and held back funds. The company's cash flow that had seemed robust began to show strain. Whitmore Realty had been built on steady relationships, trust, delivery, and reputation. The scandal introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty in real estate is corrosive. Lenders tightened credit lines. Vendors demanded shorter payment windows. A major development lost financing. Projects that once generated pride turned into liabilities when inspections and valuations were delayed. Inside the firm, the atmosphere folded inward. Department heads called emergency meetings. HR updated contingency plans while legal counsel fielded client calls. Employees whispered in hallways. Some sought reassignment to avoid association. The culture I had cultivated, stewardship and mentorship, felt compromised. Morale sagged as ambiguity increased. James attempted damage control. He toured sites, offered reassurances, and extended his hours to meet with clients. For a while his presence steadied certain accounts. But projection cannot indefinitely substitute for concrete assurances. When insurers signaled potential exposure, and a lender placed covenants under review, his composure began to fray. Employees make companies work, and their departures hurt. Several senior managers resigned, citing stability concerns. Longtime project managers accepted offers from competitors. Younger talent sought firms promising uninterrupted growth. The brain drain accelerated operational challenges and increased costs for recruitment and training. Boardroom dynamics hardened. Some members advocated restructuring, sell non-core assets, cut discretionary spending, renegotiate vendor terms. Others warned that such moves would signal weakness. Olivier argued for aggressive PR and legal defense. Others suggested settlement to preserve brand value. Debates grew heated. The company's future felt like a series of wagers. Cash flow became the brutal metric of truth. An internal review revealed short-term liabilities that had been obscured by optimistic projections. The CFO presented scenarios: layoffs, asset sales, or seeking outside capital at dilutive terms. Each option carried costs. Layoffs would damage morale. Asset sales could realize losses. Outside capital would dilute founder control. I watched these discussions with a mixture of regret and clarity. Reputations ruin ripples beyond balance sheets. It affects livelihoods. I felt responsibility not just for my dignity, but for the many employees whose lives were entwined with the company's health. The moral dimensions complicated the legal ones. Hard choices resisted easy answers. Negotiations with lenders and potential buyers produced sleepless nights. I sat at my kitchen table with documents spread and imagined resolutions. Litigation forces answers but accelerates attrition. Would the legal path I had chosen exact a price beyond restitution? Offers to buy portions of the firm were modest at first, reflective of market uncertainty. A regional competitor discussed purchasing certain assets with clauses to protect some employees, but cut management layers. A private equity group later expressed interest in a full purchase, but demanded governance changes and restrictions on founder involvement. They were practical, they were not sentimental. As sale talks intensified, James and Olivier argued about terms. James wanted to preserve the firm. Olivier insisted on protecting continuity and minimizing transitional risk. Their arguments, often sharp, aired over late calls. Two people who had once coordinated now parsed trade-offs that would affect livelihoods. In a town like ours, a sale is social as well as economic. Coffee shops buzzed with talk about what a Whitmore-less Whitmore Realty would mean for community projects. A foundation sought reassurance that scholarships supported by the firm would continue. I reached out quietly and arranged contingency funding to protect those commitments independent of corporate transactions. The fallout arrived in granular ways that did not make headlines but altered livelihoods. Vendors renegotiated contracts, Subcontractors demanded faster payment or moved on. A trusted architecture firm politely declined new proposals citing reputational risk. High-profile clients suspended engagements pending clarity. The human cost was immediate. Families who relied on steady paychecks worried about mortgages and tuition. Managers tried to reassure teams, but uncertainty breeds attrition. In community meetings, questions were blunt. Would scholarships continue? Would community projects be honored? I responded with concrete plans to ring-fence certain funds, to ensure that cultural and philanthropic commitments would not be casualties of corporate turbulence. The gesture was not theatrical. It was practical, aimed at stabilizing anxieties and protecting livelihoods. Through it all, James bore an inward ache I could not fix with legal papers. He ate poorly and walked the lot at odd hours. Olivier, for all her strategic ferocity, began to show fatigue. Quick temper flared, then retreated, replaced by long silences. The firm shuffled staff, withheld bonuses and delayed expansions. Even as negotiations continued, the cost of survival became clearer. Reputations once fractured are slow to mend. Ultimately, a buyer emerged, a coalition promising to honor certain legacy projects and retain many employees while requiring liquidation of non-core holdings. The offer provided enough liquidity to settle immediate debts and buy time. It was a negotiated stabilization rather than a triumph. The company James expanded was changed. Change arrived with lists of asset transfers and fiduciary signatures. For James, grief was private and cutting. He had to explain departures and justify losses. For Olivier, the sale was a strategic compromise. For me, it meant a chance to repay debts and perhaps live with quieter dignity. The day the verdict arrived felt like a slow eclipse. I woke to rain and the small ordinary noises of morning, and then to a phone that hummed with messages. The judge's decision would be read in a few hours, but I had already rehearsed a dozen possible endings. Settlement, split ruling, narrow victory, or defeat. In the quiet before the court convened, I felt a peculiar stillness, as if the world held its breath with me. The judge read a thorough opinion. The court found in my favor on the matter of ownership and recognized my rights as co-founder and signatory according to the documents I had submitted. He ordered an equitable distribution of assets and instructed that the company be offered for sale to satisfy competing interests and ensure an orderly resolution. He also forwarded certain findings to regulatory authorities for further review of prior transfers. Relief came as practical clarity. The ability to settle restitution that had shadowed me for a decade. Some expected spectacle. Instead, justice felt like a ledger balanced, the arithmetic of liability adjusted toward fairness. The practical implications were immediate. The firm prepared for liquidation and sale, drew asset inventories, adjusted valuations, and set a timetable. A consortium of buyers expressed interest. Negotiations began under court-appointed fiduciaries. My share, after legal costs, allowed me to repay restitution in full and to retain a modest sum sufficient for a comfortable, private life. I resolved debts that had cost me sleep for years. When news of the verdict spread, reactions were swift and varied. Some colleagues offered warm messages, an acknowledgement that long private burdens had been resolved. Critics framed the outcome as process triumphing over parental protection. Commentators debated significance, and legal scholars examined precedent. The press parsed the opinion for nuance. Bloggers and pundits spun their angles. For the many human beings involved, the ruling felt less theatrical and more consequential. James called me after the ruling. His voice held the residue of the fight, fatigue, shame, and a cautious tenderness. He asked practical questions about transition, and about certain employees he worried would be affected by the sale. I answered as factually as I could, offering names of colleagues I hoped would be prioritized for retention. Our conversation carried the shape of two people who had argued, and who now faced consequences neither had fully intended. Olivier's reaction was embittered and pragmatic. She announced that they would explore appeals and pursue regulatory defenses where appropriate. Some of her allies argued the ruling punished ambition. Others said it preserved legal consistency. She raised the possibility of filing for review but acknowledged that appeals would prolong uncertainty and could harm employees further. The court's referral to regulators added a layer of scrutiny. Authorities began inquiries into transfer details and compliance records. James faced potential administrative penalties and the prospect of public censure. We both recognized that such findings could complicate exits and make buyers more cautious. I used my portion to complete restitution and establish a reserve to protect legacy commitments, scholarships and preservation projects, insulated from corporate fate. Money in that sense felt like a new kind of stewardship, turning what had been liability into local investment. The sale process moved with the awkward grace of legal machinery. Buyers negotiated terms, fiduciaries reviewed proposals, and the court approved a consortium that promised to honor legacy projects and retain many staff. Some managers left, certain projects were reprioritized. But the settlement provided liquidity and closure. In private, the consequences rippled. Regulators reviewed records and raised issues that complicated James's standing. He faced reputational damage and possible administrative sanctions that would shadow future opportunities. We sought counsel about rebuilding credibility through community work and measured outreach. Repair would be slow and require humility. Legal victory did not instantly mend the human fabric frayed by years of secrecy. In the months after, life recalibrated. I repaid the last restitution check in a small bank. I purchased a modest lakeside home where neighbors tended gardens, and the rhythm of life felt measured. I sought quiet, long walks, dinners with an old friend, the slow pleasure of a book read without obligation. Victory, I realized, was less an announcement than a return to ordinary joys I had deferred. I did not gloat. The cost of the fight had been high. Relationships had frayed in ways that did not neatly reknit after litigation. James remained a son, but our dynamic had changed. Olivier remained distant. The town spoke of the case in mixed terms. A cautionary tale about pride and secrecy, a legal decision that corrected an imbalance, and a human story of sacrifice and consequence. The verdict closed one seam of my life and opened another. I had achieved financial freedom and the satisfaction of recognition. It was not theatrical vindication, but a rectification. In the quiet that followed, I reflected on costs, lessons, and the fragile architecture of family and enterprise. The law had spoken. Now the messy human work of repair would begin. They called it the unraveling, though unraveling suggests the process was gentle. For James it was abrupt and brutal. For Olivier it was a public paresis of social capital. The first weeks after the sale and the regulatory notices were like a tide. Patterns of withdrawal that progressed beyond corporate consequence to social estrangement. Invitations stopped arriving. Charity boards asked for distance. Mutual friends offered polite condolences, and then fell silent. It is a strange loneliness, being publicly diminished in a town that thrives on proximity. Journalists compiled timelines. Editorial cartoons exaggerated mannerisms. Late-night hosts riffed on the sons who fall from grace. Rumors filled the spaces vacated by facts. People who had previously toasted with them now cited prudence and risk as reasons to step back. In business it is common to hedge exposure. In friendship the hedging looks like absence. James's days changed. He who once attended ribbon cuttings and closed deals, now ran interference with lenders and human resources. He negotiated severance terms for managers, and tried to broker employment opportunities for people he had once promoted. Calls that had once been congratulatory became requests for help. He visited contractors to mend bridges, apologized to clients, and attempted to reframe the narrative with plans for restitution and reform. The public, however, tends to remember the angle that made the loudest headline. Olivier's social standing eroded quickly. Her carefully curated network, built on appearances and polished competence, proved thin when scandal required steadiness. Parties she had hosted months earlier no longer included her name on guest lists. The women who once celebrated her wardrobe choices and event planning spoke less, and eventually ceased to speak at all. Where she had been an organizer and influencer, she became a subject of analysis and suspicion. People assume that loss of social capital is cosmetic. It is not. Isolation affects mental health and opportunity. Opportunities evaporate. Invitations for philanthropy are rescinded. Endorsements and partnerships cool. Olivier found doors she once expected to open closed. She attempted goodwill gestures, donations, public statements of concern for employee welfare, but the gestures read like damage control. Legally, the regulatory inquiry complicated matters. An administrative review targeted certain transfers associated with restitution. Potential fines and professional censure were discussed in confidential memos. James faced a professional limbo. He was capable, experienced, and yet burdened by an aura of impropriety. Recruiters were cautious, and boardrooms preferred leaders with unblemished records. That calculus is unforgiving. Their relationship suffered. Tensions that had once been discreet became whispered gossip. Friends wondered whether strain would bring divorce or quiet separation. They began to spend nights apart more frequently, and when they did appear together it was with a careful, rehearsed cordiality. The public learned of clinic visits and counseling appointments more through rumor than candor, and that veil of secrecy invited speculation. Attempts to rebuild were earnest but halting. James volunteered for community service projects, spoke at small panels about corporate responsibility, and sought mentorship for a slower, less public return to work. Olivier networked quietly with a few loyal colleagues and sought a quieter role advising smaller firms. Both did work that suggested contrition without spectacle. Some doors did open. Old colleagues who believed in James's competence quietly offered consultancy roles or introductions abroad. A few local nonprofits accepted discreet donations funded by my settlement to maintain programs without taking public bows. These were pragmatic measures. People sought to preserve livelihoods while acknowledging reputational damage. Still, the social consequences hung heavy. Invitations that once signaled inclusion no longer arrived. Neighborhood associations removed their names from donor walls. Former allies posted neutral statements, or none at all. In the places that mattered to them, funding committees, charitable boards, invitations to speak, the absence was palpable. When people vanish from networks that confer prestige, the fall is both social and structural. I felt a complex mixture watching their decline. Compassion for a son who had made mistakes sat beside a sober recognition of consequences. I did not savor their discomfort. The fight had not been designed to ruin them, but to correct a legal and moral imbalance. Yet correction and ruin can be adjacent. Remedial action often carries collateral damage. In the years that followed, they took disparate paths toward repair. James, stripped of office, mentored young developers and taught a practical community college course. Small, steady work rebuilding competence away from glare. Olivier consulted with nonprofits on operations, accepting modest fees and avoiding interviews. They learned to do their work without applause. Gradually some trust reappeared, but the breadth of influence they once had remained narrowed, and they continued to face consequences with patience and resolve daily. Time, of course, does much of the work. Rebuilding reputations takes years. Consistent service, visible humility, and steady financial responsibility. James and Olivier both began that slow labor. The town watched. Some welcomed their return in small ways, others reserved trust. The fall had been public. The redemption, if it came, would be quieter and earned. Silence can be a loud thing when you have used to filling rooms with decisions and directives. After the sale and the last restitution check, I moved to a small lakeside house where mornings were measured by mist and the sound of oars on water. I moved there to breathe without investor calls. The house had a narrow porch, a neighbor-tended garden, and a kitchen where light collected just so. It was modest and private, a place to relearn the shape of ordinary days. My days settled into a restorative rhythm. I walked the shoreline early while the town still slept, and I read books I had not finished in years. I wrote letters, short notes to former staff offering references, and to community leaders proposing ways to secure scholarship funds outside corporate structures. Small tasks, repairing a fence, ordering a library chair, planting bulbs, became quiet joys. These actions felt like the slow healing of a life whose edges had been scoured by headlines. People asked why I pursued the suit if I would not celebrate its victory. It was about recognition and balance, not malice. Silence was part of the choice, yes, but not emptiness. Choosing not to gloat is a way to deprive remorse of the satisfaction of spectacle. The nightmare I intended would not be loud, it would be structural. Reputation, once fractured, is difficult to restore. To be reduced to a caricature of greed is worse than many monetary losses. Legal victory did not erase complexity. Some people supported me openly, offering dinners and small kindnesses. Others continued to whisper about choices and consequences. Occasionally someone approached me at the library and spoke of a time Whitmore Realty negotiated a payment plan and saved a family's home. These small testimonies felt like private verdicts in my favor. Such notes mattered. They were the human record behind the legal record. I created trust accounts to guarantee scholarships, preservation funds, and a community health initiative. Charity was private correction. Stewardship felt like a better revenge than headlines. I wanted the work we had begun to survive independent of corporate machinery. That kind of quiet, steady investment felt like writing a ledger while leaving dignity intact. At times I imagined what James and Olivier experienced. I thought of James traveling to a site and finding a project behind schedule, of Olivier attending a meeting and sensing the coolness of once warm allies. I did not relish their suffering. I had hoped accountability would teach and restore. Consequences can be heavy and long, and I carried some of their pain as a reminder that action entails responsibility. Letters arrived. Cruel notes and thoughtful messages from those helped by our projects. The cruel ones stung, echoing the old whisper that had started everything. The thoughtful letters steadied me. They reminded me that a life is measured by quiet help, not by headlines. In those messages I found the temperate affirmation that what I had done was not simply legal maneuvering, but an attempt to correct an imbalance. With time the sting dulled. Whitmore Realty changed hands, clients adjusted, and new narratives emerged. People asked if I regretted the lawsuit. I recited the ledger, years of payments, cedar chest papers, and quiet decisions to preserve a son's future. Regret did not fit. I had acted to correct an imbalance. Friends returned in measured ways. Some conversations were tentative at first, then gradually more open. I hosted small dinners and invited people who had worked for the company for decades. We spoke of contractors, garden tips, and the small triumphs of a book well read. Those evenings stitched together a life that had been frayed, confirming that repair often comes through ordinary presence rather than grand gestures. At dusk I watch the lake and think of the kitchen table where decisions were made. Revenge once meant exposure. Now it means repair. Each act of quiet stewardship felt corrective. I hoped they would learn humility. If they suffered, I hoped it taught them to value truth before convenience. I do not claim perfect justice. I achieved recognition, and a life free from that restitution's shadow. Their nightmare was the loss of what they had assumed would be unshakable. A reputation that, once questioned, altered opportunities and intimacy. I kept silent. Silence was the sting that fueled the work. In restraint, I found the truest revenge I could conceive. To live well, uphold commitments, and continue with measured dignity. This story you've just listened to is a work of fiction, though it draws inspiration from the kind of betrayals, secrets, and family conflicts that often play out behind closed doors. Names, characters, and events have been altered for dramatic effect, but the emotions, the pain of rejection, the hunger for justice, and the lengths people will go to for revenge, are very real to many who have lived through similar circumstances. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Sharon was justified in exposing James and Olivier, or did she go too far? Was her fight for dignity and revenge a show of strength, or a descent into obsession? And if you were in Sharon's position, what choice would you have made? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.